The first grain shipments out of Ukraine under a deal brokered by the UN and Turkey could herald the easing of a global food crisis sparked by the conflict. Ukraine has warned it will take months before grain exports from Odessa and neighboring ports reach pre-war levels, despite the relaxation of a Russian blockade in the Black Sea. Welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. The World Food Programme estimates that 47 million people have moved into a stage of acute hunger because of the Ukraine war. Western officials have accused Russia of using food as a weapon during its invasion. The United Nations and Turkey helped broker an agreement which calls for Russia's fleet in the Black Sea to allow safe passage through areas that Russia has blockaded since it launched its invasion of Ukraine in late February. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the deal an agreement for the world at the signing ceremony in Istanbul. Can the world trust Russia to stick to the agreement, and will this short-term deal be enough to halt the spiraling global food crisis? Well, joining us now to discuss this from Faro, Portugal, Arnaud Petit, the Executive Director of the International Grain Council. In London, Domitilla Sagramoso, Senior Lecturer in Security and Development at King's College. And joining us from Kiev in Ukraine, we have Mykola Vorobiov, Ukrainian political and military journalist. Good to have you all with us. So, Mykola, if I could start with you. Is this deal going to stick? How confident are you that the grain is going to get to where it needs to go and Ukrainians will benefit from it?
I would say it's yes and no. On the one hand, President Zelensky, he announced that Ukraine has about $10 billion in their stocks of the grain, which can be exported. And the treaty, which was signed on July 23 between Turkey, UN, Ukraine, and Russia, is about to kick off. On the other hand, we saw that Russians, they already broke any possible and impossible deals, beginning from the Helsinki human rights signed by the USSR in the 70s, the Budapest Memorandum, and the most important, the two main deals, the two main ceasefire treaties, which were signed in 2014 and then in 2015 in Minsk. So basically, in this case, I doubt that the Kremlin can be trusted at this point, but we will see, because on the other hand, Turkey has never presented as a guarantor of such a deal. So Ukraine is ready. Ukraine Foreign Ministry already announced that it is about to ship the first shipment of this grain to export. But it's still yet to be seen if this deal will work out for all sides.
Yeah, a lot of questions remain unanswered, Domitilla. And why do you think Russia is agreeing to this now after, more than 5 months of conflict in Ukraine?
Well, Russia has a few advantages in this deal as well, because there is some guarantee as well that it can export its own wheat and grain products, and as well as fertilizers, and that these will not be attacked or sequestered. And we have to remember that Russia is now exporting grain that belongs actually to Ukraine, because it has been taken from areas that are under Russian occupation. So to a certain extent, it benefits Russia. Also, in a certain way, it sort of eases relations with countries in the Middle East who are putting a lot of pressure on Russia to ensure that grain reaches Middle Eastern countries such as Egypt, even Saudi Arabia, Iran, Lebanon. Also, African countries such as Senegal have been lobbying in Moscow. So Russia, in a way, doesn't want to appear any longer, I think, as sort of the main country responsible for this, significant food crisis, and has been made aware of the risks that a lot of instability can follow and can ensue. So Russia also has benefited from the fact that to a certain extent, some sanctions have been eased for a group of banks that are involved in these commercial transactions, such as Bank Russia, which has links to Putin and his friends, also VTB and others. So this sort of easing of sanctions, which is part of a separate agreement between Russia and the European Union and Russia and the United States, also benefits, these banks and benefits the companies that are involved in the export of agricultural products from Russia. And some of these companies have, interestingly, links to the Kremlin, and I can say more about this. But for example, one of these companies belongs to the son-in-law of Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. So there are also sort of connections there of, elements within the elites that are to benefit because they are in the business of agricultural exports.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned some of those countries because we're going to put up a graphic now that shows some of that. These are the countries that will be receiving the grain where Ukraine's wheat exports go. You mentioned Egypt there. That is the largest importer of Ukrainian grain, 3.62, and a number of other Middle Eastern countries there as well, Yemen, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, mostly developing countries there. So clearly these countries will benefit from the resumption of these supplies the most. And I want to turn to Arnaud Petit on this. How much of a difference will this make for global grain supplies, and how far will it go to alleviating the current shortages in those countries?
So first of all, it is in terms of prices, and we have seen the price of wheat go down and below the price of the wheat of the war in Ukraine. The second point is also that semi-processed product. Turkey is importing a lot of wheat from Black Sea area, processing it in flours or in pasta, and re-exporting to the Middle East. So that's also very important to look at the semi-processed product market. And the third point is also, if farmers in Ukraine are able to export the grains, that means they will see grain in autumn to harvest in 2023. So it's very important to look today on the market, but also for the next harvest in 23. That's a 3 point very important in this agreement.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more about the terms of this deal, and we're going to bring another graphic now that shows this. Now, under the terms of this deal, a coalition of Turkish, Ukrainian, and UN staff would monitor the loading of grain onto ships and ensure they're not carrying weapons. Ukrainian vessels would guide commercial vessels along safe paths through mined areas along the coast. Vessels would be monitored by the same coalition as they cross the Black Sea towards the Bosporus Strait. Those are the terms of the deal. Now, just in looking at some of that, Mykola, it does seem that a lot of this is based on trust and not much more than that in this,
yes.
At this point. And trust exactly, is very much in short supply.
I would just like to add, because maybe some of our audience forgot, but just the next day after the treaty was signed, the Russians, they hit their grain depot in Odessa seaport, actually in Ukraine, and it was aimed to target just the grain which was about to be loaded and exported. So also I would like to remind that Russians are waging the war of attrition. So basically, by invading from the south, after the 5 months of the aggression, they blocked Ukraine from the access to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And as a result, Ukraine loses roughly 40% of its revenue in foreign currency. I would just remind you also that Ukraine export was through the sea ports of Azov and Black Sea, and it's about 80% of the export by the sea of its agricultural products. So basically, it seemed that Russians, they don't want Ukraine economy to grow, and it seemed they want to block this somehow. And this, they also launched this provocation by attacking the seaport of Odessa. And I doubt that they will stick with their commitments in the future. Moreover, it's yet to be seen what will be Turkey's response if there will be some provocations from the Russian side, because according to the doctrine of Monroe Doctrine, signed in 1939, Turkey has a legal right to use its navy against anybody who violated this treaty. So basically, the question remains to be open if Istanbul will shut fire on the Russian vessels or the Russian aircrafts which violated this shipping of this grain by attacking Ukrainian or international civilian ships. Again, so the question remains open.
Domitilla, what are the mechanisms, if any, to enforce this deal, to make sure that it works?
Well, in a way, it relies very much on goodwill. I mean, there isn't a proper enforcement mechanism. I think there is an external guarantee which is provided by the United Nations and by Turkey to make sure that, for example, there is no military equipment on the vessels when they return back home, for example, to Ukraine. So there is clearly sort of an attempt to monitor a lot of these vessels and to make sure they only carrying agricultural products. But you know, a lot of it, as was explained by the previous speaker, I mean, is relying on goodwill, and there isn't really any other way to ensure that this agreement sort of functions effectively. And as was also mentioned, the fact that the day after the agreement was signed, you know, the port of Odessa was hit, you know, clearly shows that there is a lot of sort of skepticism and that Russia wanted to send a message that it was still sort of ready to continue the fight even in those areas. And that was not even the only attack in the area. There were several other attacks that took place. So I think it is really holding in very sort of shaky grounds, and there isn't an effective mechanism to enforce it. But at the same time, there is a very strong pressure globally from all sides to make sure that Russia abides by this agreement and accepts the terms. Because as I mentioned earlier, Russia also can benefit. It used to export, you know, 11 billion to export agricultural products for $11 billion a year. So it really can also benefit from the export of its own agricultural and fertilizer products. But it's going to be very difficult to see whether this is actually going to be implemented. And if I may add one point, which worries me very much, is the fact that Ukraine is going to be forced to demine certain areas around the Odessa port. And I worry that Russia may take an opportunity then to sort of feel that there is a bigger opportunity to sort of intervene militarily and carry out an amphibious landing in Odessa. So I'm quite worried also about the fact that this agreement, for obvious reasons, has to involve demining of the lanes through which these products and these vessels are going to transit. And Russia may sort of eventually find an opportunity to sort of exploit and carry out a military attack, an amphibious landing in Odessa.
Arnaud, how much damage was done in not getting this grain to the countries that I mentioned earlier sooner, after 5 months of conflict?
Well, the damage has been mainly on the food basket. The price of food basket increased tremendously on developing countries. A country like Egypt, we have assessed that indeed the overcost, the price is around $50 to $70 per ton of wheat import. And Egypt is importing in average year 7 to 8 million tons of wheat. So you see it's a lot of money for those countries. The things I would like to add is, it is right that agreement is based on the goodwill of the two parties, but I would say there is also an interest from the two parties to have this agreement working properly. particularly for Russia, because they're exporting an average 30 to 35 million tons of wheat. And this can be done only with the big cargoes. And they need to have a safe Black Sea area to do this trade also. So I would say, economically speaking, it makes sense for both parties to implement these agreements.
Mykola, if this agreement largely works, could this form a basis for establishing further trust between Russia and Ukraine in other areas, perhaps? And I know this is a short-term agreement right now, 120 days, and perhaps the chances of renewing this deal for further time after that.
Hazan, I would disagree with their statements that they are seeking just to increase their grain export, or they somehow care about their economy. So basically, they spent about $15 billion a month for this war, just for active warfare. And it seems they keep getting revenues by exporting oil and gas. And only from the European Union, they receive roughly $1 billion a day. So basically, they can afford this war. And I doubt that they really care much about how much grain, their own grain, they will sold or they export. So they have money, shortly. Second point is that in many ways, the Kremlin shows that they are increasing their export of grains. And this year, their harvest is 15% higher than the last year. But basically, they export this from the occupied and destroyed cities like Mariupol. So basically, which means they already started stealing of the Ukrainian grains and selling into the another countries. So they are stealers. And I doubt how we can establish any kind of deals with those who break the deal at the beginning. And as to your question, will it bring together closer to reconciliation between Kyiv and Moscow? I would say no, because Moscow, they still keep talking about the language not of the negotiation, but of the ultimatums. They didn't refuse about their lunatic goals to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. So Ukraine has to give up its territories. It has to recognize annexed Crimea and already occupied southern and eastern regions, which is impossible. I will just remind, according to the last recent polling, roughly 87% of Ukrainians, they consider a victory to their country only if Ukraine will get their territories back, not by 2014 when Russians annexed Crimea and grabbed part of Ukrainian Donbass, but to the 1991 when Ukraine got its independence. So Ukrainian people, they will not tolerate ceding of any inch of the Ukrainian land to Russia, which makes it almost impossible to achieve any diplomatic deal at this point. So everything in the nearby future will be decided that exclusively on the battlefield.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more about the Russian side of this, because the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has offered reassurances over Russian grain supplies on a visit to Cairo with the Egyptian Foreign Minister. And this is what he said.
Today we have considered in detail those steps our respective departments, Russian and Egyptian foreign ministries, need to prevent damage from Western sanctions from our economic bounds. We want to reconfigure our relationship under new conditions caused by illegitimate sanctions from the US and their allies.
Domitilla, if I could turn back to you on this, and I believe you may have touched on this earlier, in terms of looking at why Russia is agreeing to this now. The suggestion is that they had a great deal of pressure from many of these countries, like Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries, developing countries that depend on these food supplies, to come to the table and agree to this. What's your take on that?
I certainly think that the pressures were very important, and that the demands of these countries to ask Russia to ease the trade of grain coming out of Ukraine was really an important factor. Nobody was really believing this argument that the sanctions were the main reason why, there wasn't an effective sort of grain trade coming out of Ukraine. So the narrative and the text that you read, where Lavrov is blaming sort of Western sanctions for this crisis, this food crisis, doesn't really make any sense at all, because Ukraine should have been able, under normal circumstances, to continue exporting, but the war itself and the blockade of the ports of Ukraine, made it really hard. So to a great extent, the pressures, I think, played a part, because Russia doesn't want to be seen any longer as sort of the one who's causing this major food crisis globally. And the second point, I think, is to highlight that Russia also benefits, because there is a guarantee that its own agricultural exports are going to transit safely through the Black Sea. And what is most importantly for me is that there is a sort of de facto recognition that Russia can export through Ukrainian ports in a way, which are under occupation. And that is one of my greatest worries, is that de facto Russia is able to export through ports in Crimea and in the Sea of Azov, which belong to Ukraine. But in a way, they're sort of indirectly recognized as potential transit routes in this deal, although this is not said openly. The fact that Russia is allowed to export safely through the Black Sea, to a certain extent, de facto sort of certifies Russia's control over these areas. And that is really what worries me, that there is no mention of Ukraine having to retake control over ports in the Sea of Azov and eventually also in Crimea, also because the Sea of Azov was really one of the main export routes of agricultural products for Ukraine. And there is no mention of that in the agreement. So if we think longer term, in terms of additional agreements signed between Russia and Ukraine, I think that this is going to be a very serious issue, because Ukraine, of course, is very insisting that these ports on the Sea of Azov and in Crimea belong to Ukraine. And this agreement may, to a certain extent, sort of de facto admit that these are under Russian occupation.
All right, let's put that then to Arnaud. How much of a concern is this then for the grain supplies and getting them out of those Ukrainian ports?
Well, it's exporting grains. It's a very complex ecosystem, if I may say so. It's not just the port, not just the ship owner. You have also the farmers. So it's very complicated, complex system, I would say. And you need to address all the concerns of these different operators, and particularly for the farmers first to sell the product, and farmers are price takers. The cost of transportation is very high at the moment in Ukraine, so there is not a huge appetite to export. Secondly, the shipping owners, they don't have insurance, or the premium of insurance is very prohibitive to send steel ship to that area. So you see, it's just restarting. And I would say the 4 months agreement would help for Ukraine to store the harvests which are happening now. Because the matter is Ukraine is storage capacity is more or less full, and now they need to have space to export, to put the grains on the store. And that's very important to have these grains out. And as I said also, is we have to look forward next year. If Ukrainian farmers are in bankruptcy, that means we have maybe 10 million tons of wheat less than we have this year in production. That means the price on the global market will be higher and higher. So I think here there is a really interest. And from the Russian side, and on Black Sea area, I would say it is a question of reputations. Our country will come back in Black Sea area. Is it in Ukraine and Russia? If there is no trust between these two countries to work. It will not happen. Just bear in mind that when Russia did an embargo on wheat, it took for all the Russian business, it took 3 years to come back on the business and to work with confidence with companies. So you may imagine if this agreement fails, indeed, it will take more than 3 years even for the Russian side to rebuild confidence with different operators and to export, as I said, 35 till 40 million tons of wheat on a yearly basis.
I'll give the last word on this to you, Mykola. If this deal doesn't work out, what implications does it have for Ukrainians then?
Hassan, I think that it has some complicities from the beginning. So basically, we are discussing the grain issues and the food crisis, which is a humanitarian stuff. On the other hand, we have a political stuff. So it means that Ukraine and Kyiv, it's not likely that it will agree to cede the Ukrainian territories and just step back in the political negotiations, somehow to exchange it for the grain export. So basically, I think that we should divide to these three issues. But again, I don't believe that Russia at this point can be trusted. It already attacked Ukrainian grain depots, and it keeps illegally using Ukrainian seaports and attacking their grain fields and particularly agricultural facilities in Ukraine. I remain hopeful, but given the recent history, I don't believe it will be as worked out as perfectly as it's signed on the paper.
All right, on that, we're going to have to leave it. Thanks very much for being with us, Arnaud Petit, Domitilla Sagramoso, and Mykola Vorobiov. Thanks very much for being on Roundtable. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thanks for watching.